Do you know the difference between a traffic stop and a career-ending mistake? Sometimes it is just one name. The words had not been spoken yet, but they would soon become the lesson Officer Daniel Whitmore would never forget. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon on a two-lane highway outside Arlington, Virginia. The sky stretched wide and clear above the road, sunlight reflecting off passing vehicles and the tall trees lining the highway. To most people, it looked like an ordinary day. A day where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the ones that reveal the deepest truths about people. Officer Daniel Whitmore sat behind the wheel of his patrol cruiser, watching traffic move steadily ahead. For 15 years, he had worn the uniform of a local police officer. To him, the badge represented authority, order, and control. He believed he could read situations quickly. That experience gave him the ability to judge people before they even spoke. But there was one thing he had forgotten. A uniform can show a person's job. It cannot reveal their character. A few miles ahead, a black sedan moved calmly along the highway. Behind the wheel was Victoria Reynolds, a woman who appeared to be like anyone else on the road. She wore a simple navy blazer, kept both hands relaxed on the steering wheel, and listened quietly to the soft sound of the radio playing in the background. There were no signs that would make her stand out. No military uniform. No medals. No official entourage. Nothing that announced the truth about who she was. Because Victoria Reynolds was not just another driver. She was a general in the United States Air Force, a woman who had spent decades serving her country, leading teams, making decisions under pressure, and earning respect across the highest levels of the military. But on that afternoon, she was simply Victoria. A mother. A mentor. A citizen driving home. And that was exactly what made what happened next so important. Daniel Whitmore noticed the vehicle ahead and made a decision. He turned his cruiser around, activated his lights, and followed the sedan. The flashing lights appeared in Victoria's rearview mirror. She calmly slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. The world around her became quieter. The passing cars continued moving, the wind brushed against the trees, and the afternoon sun continued shining as if nothing had changed. Victoria looked into her mirror and saw the officer approaching. She did not panic. She did not argue. She simply waited. Because after decades of leadership, she understood something many people never learn. The person who stays calm often has the clearest view of the situation. Daniel walked toward the vehicle with confidence. He believed he was approaching a routine stop. He believed he was the person in control. He believed the badge on his chest gave him the final word. But he had no idea that the woman sitting behind that steering wheel had spent her life around people who carried far greater responsibilities than a simple traffic stop. He had no idea that within minutes, a phone call would travel beyond this quiet road. He had no idea that his captain would soon hear a name that would change everything. Because the woman he thought he was stopping was not someone looking for special treatment. She was someone who had spent her entire career making sure others were treated fairly. And on that afternoon, Officer Daniel Whitmore was about to discover that true authority is not always the loudest voice on the road. Sometimes it is the person sitting quietly, waiting for the truth to be revealed. The first thing Daniel Whitmore noticed was not the calm expression on Victoria Reynolds' face. It was the fact that she did not react the way he expected. Most drivers became nervous when the flashing lights appeared behind them. Some rushed to explain themselves before a question was even asked. Others searched for the right words, hoping to end the conversation as quickly as possible. But Victoria simply sat quietly, waiting with patience. That quiet confidence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Daniel approached the black sedan and looked through the window. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the windshield, making the moment feel almost frozen in time. The highway continued moving around them. But inside that small space, two very different views of authority were about to meet. License and registration, Daniel said firmly. Victoria lowered the window and handed over the requested documents without hesitation. "Of course, officer," she replied. Her voice was calm and respectful. There was no anger, no challenge, no attempt to use her position to influence the situation. She simply answered as any citizen would. Daniel glanced at the documents and then back at her. He noticed her composed posture and the way she maintained eye contact. He had met confident people before, but there was something different about her. It was not arrogance. It was not someone trying to prove importance. It was the kind of confidence that came from years of discipline and experience. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Daniel asked. Victoria looked at him and calmly replied, "I assume you will explain that, officer." The answer was polite, but it carried a quiet strength. Daniel expected discomfort. He expected someone trying to defend themselves quickly. Instead, he found someone who seemed completely comfortable standing in the middle of uncertainty. The officer continued asking questions while Victoria answered carefully. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She understood that patience often reveals more than arguments ever could. But Daniel had already created a picture in his mind. He was not seeing the person in front of him. He was seeing his own assumptions. And that was the mistake that would follow him long after this moment ended. For Victoria, this was not the first time she had experienced someone making a judgment before knowing her story. Throughout her career, she had entered rooms where people underestimated her before hearing her ideas. She had faced moments where she had to prove herself twice as much simply because others were unwilling to see beyond their first impression. But she had learned something valuable. Respect gained through character lasted longer than respect demanded through a title. That was why she never introduced herself with her rank unless it was necessary. She believed leadership was not about making people feel small. It was about understanding responsibility. Daniel looked again at the information in his hands, unaware that there was far more history behind that name than he could imagine. Victoria Reynolds was not someone who needed to announce her achievements. She did not need a uniform to command respect. She did not need a room full of people standing at attention to prove her value. The years of service, the difficult decisions, and the trust placed in her were already part of who she was. Yet standing on the side of that Virginia highway, none of that was visible. All Daniel saw was the person he had decided she was. The road remained quiet. The sky remained clear. But the tension between them grew, not because Victoria had lost control, but because Daniel was beginning to realize that this situation was not as simple as he first believed. Somewhere beyond that highway, people who knew Victoria's name were going about their day, unaware that a routine traffic stop was slowly becoming a moment that would reveal the difference between having authority and understanding it. And Daniel Whitmore was about to learn that the most important details about a person are often the ones you cannot see at first glance. Long before Victoria Reynolds ever sat behind the wheel of that black sedan on a quiet Virginia highway, she had learned a lesson that shaped every decision she made. A person's true strength was not measured by how many people knew their title. It was measured by how they treated people who did not know it. For more than 3 decades, Victoria had carried responsibilities that few people ever understood. She had entered rooms where decisions affected thousands of lives. She had studied complex situations where patience mattered more than speed and where every word carried weight. Yet despite all those years of service, she never allowed her position to become a wall between herself and others. To the people who worked with her, she was not just General Victoria Reynolds. She was the leader who listened before speaking, the mentor who remembered names, and the person who believed that respect was something earned every day. Years earlier, when Victoria first began her military career, many people underestimated her. They noticed things that had nothing to do with her ability. They focused on appearances before achievements. They made assumptions before hearing her voice. But Victoria never allowed those moments to define her. She understood that every challenge was another opportunity to show what dedication and discipline could accomplish. Over time, her record spoke louder than any introduction ever could. She became known for her calm decision-making, her ability to guide teams through difficult situations, and her commitment to protecting the people who depended on her. But on this afternoon, none of that was visible. There was no Air Force uniform, no official ceremony, no room filled with colleagues who understood her accomplishments. There was only a highway, a traffic stop, and a stranger making conclusions without knowing her story. As Daniel Whitmore continued asking questions beside the vehicle, Victoria remained composed. She looked beyond the moment itself. She understood that Daniel was not seeing the years behind her. He was only seeing what was directly in front of him. And that was something she had encountered many times throughout her life. The world often noticed the surface first. It noticed the clothing, the voice, the appearance, and the things people expected to see. But real leadership came from what remained unseen. The discipline built over years. The sacrifices made when nobody was watching. The responsibility carried quietly without needing recognition. Victoria glanced toward the open road ahead. She thought about the reason she had chosen a life of service in the first place. It was never about power. It was never about receiving special treatment. It was about creating a better environment for the people who came after her. She knew that someone without her experience, without her resources, and without her ability to call for support might face a much more difficult situation. That thought stayed with her. Because Victoria did not see this moment as a personal inconvenience. She saw it as a reminder of why fairness mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware of the person standing before him. He saw a routine interaction. He saw a driver who was calm but unfamiliar. He saw a situation he believed he understood. But every second that passed brought him closer to discovering that some stories cannot be judged from the first chapter. The afternoon continued quietly around them. Cars passed. The wind moved through the trees. The world kept going. Yet beneath the surface, something important was unfolding. Not because Victoria wanted attention. Not because she wanted to prove who she was. But because sometimes the truth does not need to announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits until the right moment arrives. And soon, Daniel Whitmore would learn that the person he thought he had figured out was someone whose story reached far beyond that roadside stop. The road remained quiet, but the atmosphere around the black sedan had changed. What began as a simple traffic stop was becoming something much more complicated, not because Victoria Reynolds had raised her voice or challenged the officer, but because her calmness created a contrast Daniel Whitmore could not ignore. He stood beside the vehicle, holding the documents in his hand, searching for something that would confirm the assumption he had already made. But the more he looked, the more uncertain the situation became. Victoria watched him carefully, not with anger, but with awareness. She understood that moments like this were rarely about one question or one answer. They were about how people chose to treat each other when they believed nobody important was watching. "Is there something else you need, officer?" Victoria asked. Her tone remained respectful. Daniel paused for a moment. He was used to people reacting differently. He was used to drivers becoming impatient, nervous, or defensive. But Victoria was none of those things. She was steady. She was composed. And somehow, that made the situation feel more difficult for him. "I am just making sure everything checks out," Daniel replied. Victoria nodded slightly. "I understand." Those two words carried no challenge. They carried no frustration. They simply acknowledged the process. But Daniel continued looking for answers that had nothing to do with the information in front of him. He asked additional questions, each one creating a longer pause between them. Victoria answered each question clearly. She did not rush him. She did not try to use her position to end the conversation. In her experience, people often revealed more through their actions than their words. A person's patience, their willingness to listen, and their ability to remain respectful under pressure often showed their true character. A few vehicles passed by on the highway. Some drivers glanced toward the scene before continuing on their way. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like an ordinary roadside interaction. But inside that small space of time, something deeper was happening. Daniel believed he was evaluating Victoria. He did not realize that his own choices were revealing far more about himself. Victoria noticed the way he spoke, the way he approached the conversation, and the assumptions hidden beneath his questions. Still, she remained silent about what she knew. She had spent enough years in leadership to understand that people sometimes learn the most when they were allowed to recognize their own mistakes. She did not need to announce her achievements. She did not need to explain the rooms she had entered, the responsibilities she had carried, or the trust that had been placed in her hands. Those things were part of her journey, but they were not the reason she treated people with respect. Daniel looked again at the documents. The name in front of him was the same name that appeared in important military records, the same name known by leaders far beyond this quiet stretch of highway. But to him, it was just a name on a page. He had not yet connected the person in front of him with the reputation behind that name. And that was the moment where the difference between knowledge and understanding became clear. Anyone could read information. Anyone could see details. But true understanding required looking beyond the surface. Victoria had spent her life doing exactly that. She had learned that every person carried a story that could not be seen immediately. She knew the danger of judging someone before learning who they truly were. Daniel, however, was still trapped in that first impression. He believed this was a situation he controlled completely. He believed the conversation would end whenever he decided it would. But the world has a way of revealing what people choose not to see. Somewhere beyond this highway, a name was about to travel through official channels. A name that would transform a routine moment into a lesson about respect, responsibility, and the meaning of true authority. And Daniel Whitmore was only moments away from discovering that the person standing quietly in front of him was far more than he ever imagined. The documents remained in Daniel Whitmore's hands, but the situation was no longer as simple as it appeared. The name printed on the page was familiar to someone somewhere, but to Daniel, it was still just another detail in a routine stop. He continued reviewing the information, unaware that he was standing beside a person whose responsibilities reached far beyond this quiet Virginia highway. Victoria Reynolds watched patiently through the open window. She noticed the small changes in Daniel's behavior. The longer the conversation continued, the more he seemed to search for something that would support his first impression. But facts had a way of creating their own story. And the facts in front of him were beginning to tell a story he had not expected. "Everything appears to be in order," Victoria said calmly. Her words were not meant to challenge him. They were simply a reminder that the situation did not match the assumption he had made. Daniel looked back at her. "I am still reviewing everything," he replied. Victoria nodded. "Take your time." Those words carried more meaning than he realized. She was not trying to rush the moment. She was allowing the process to happen while remaining aware of something important. People often revealed themselves during ordinary moments. Not during ceremonies. Not during speeches. Not when everyone was watching. But during the small interactions where they believed they had complete control. A gentle breeze moved across the highway as the afternoon continued. The trees along the roadside shifted quietly, and the sound of passing vehicles filled the distance. The scene looked completely normal. Yet Victoria understood that many important moments in life did not announce themselves. They arrived quietly and tested what people truly believed. Daniel stepped back slightly and looked toward his patrol cruiser. He considered the information again. Something about Victoria's confidence did not match the situation he thought he understood. There was a level of professionalism in her answers that stood out. She was not behaving like someone trying to avoid responsibility. She was behaving like someone who understood responsibility better than most people. But instead of recognizing that difference, Daniel continued searching for an explanation that fit his original assumption. What he did not know was that Victoria's name carried a history built over decades. Behind that simple name was a lifetime of service, leadership, and commitment. There were people across the country who recognized her immediately. People who understood the significance of her work. People who knew that her decisions had influenced important missions and supported countless individuals. But Victoria had never measured her value by how many people recognized her. She measured it by the impact she could make when nobody was looking. That belief was one of the reasons she had reached the highest levels of military leadership. Not because she demanded attention, but because she understood the responsibility that came with it. Daniel returned his attention to the vehicle. He had no idea that the details he was overlooking were the very details that would soon change everything. He did not know that a simple name could open a much larger conversation. He did not know that people far beyond this roadside would soon become aware of what was happening. And most importantly, he did not understand that Victoria was not waiting for special treatment. She was waiting to see whether the person in front of her would choose fairness when nobody was forcing him to. For Victoria, this moment represented something larger than herself. She thought about the many people who did not have a career, a title, or a network of support behind them. She thought about those who might experience difficult situations without anyone knowing their story. That was why she remained calm. That was why she chose patience over frustration. Because she knew that true character was revealed when there was no applause, no audience, and no reward. Daniel finally looked at the documents one more time. A small detail caught his attention. Not enough to reveal everything. Not enough to answer every question. But enough to create a feeling that something about this situation was different. Somewhere in the distance, a phone was about to ring. Somewhere, a person was about to hear Victoria Reynolds' name. And when that happened, Daniel would finally understand that the person he had been questioning was not someone who needed to prove her importance. Her entire life had already done that. The small detail Daniel Whitmore noticed on the documents stayed in his mind longer than he expected. He had seen thousands of names during his years as an officer. Most of them passed through his hands and disappeared moments later. But something about this one felt different. Not because he understood its importance yet, but because the confidence of the person behind the name did not match the situation he thought he was dealing with. Victoria Reynolds remained seated, calm and patient, watching the officer process information that was slowly changing the direction of the entire encounter. She did not know exactly what Daniel was thinking, but she understood the hesitation in his movements. She had seen that moment before. The moment when someone realizes the story they created in their mind does not completely match reality. Daniel looked toward his patrol vehicle, then back at the documents. The afternoon sun continued to shine over the highway, creating a peaceful scene that seemed disconnected from the growing uncertainty between them. "I may need to make a quick call to verify some information," Daniel finally said. Victoria simply nodded. "That is fine, officer." Again, there was no anger in her voice. No attempt to make him feel embarrassed. Just patience. That response surprised him. He expected resistance. He expected someone to become frustrated. Instead, Victoria gave him exactly what a professional situation required: cooperation and respect. Daniel walked back toward his cruiser. As he moved away, Victoria looked out at the road ahead. She thought about how quickly assumptions could form. A person could look at someone for only a few seconds and believe they understood everything about them. They could mistake silence for weakness. They could mistake confidence for attitude. They could mistake a lack of explanation for a lack of importance. But Victoria knew better. Her entire life had been built around looking deeper. Back inside the patrol cruiser, Daniel picked up his phone. He prepared to contact his captain, Robert Hayes, for a routine verification. At least, that was what he believed it would be. Captain Hayes was known throughout the department as someone who valued professionalism and careful judgment. He had spent years teaching younger officers that every interaction mattered because every person had a story they could not see. Daniel had heard those words before. But hearing advice and truly understanding it were two different things. The phone rang. Miles away, inside the police department, Captain Robert Hayes looked at the incoming call. It was not unusual for officers to contact him during their shifts. Traffic questions, paperwork concerns, and routine situations happened every day. He answered without expecting anything unusual. "Captain Hayes speaking." Daniel explained that he was handling a traffic stop and needed assistance confirming information connected to the driver. At first, the conversation sounded completely normal. But then Daniel mentioned the name on the documents. There was a pause. A brief moment of silence that Daniel did not understand. On the other end of the call, Captain Hayes was processing what he had just heard. Because that name was not ordinary. That name belonged to someone whose reputation extended far beyond a local police department. Someone whose career represented decades of dedication, leadership, and service. "Daniel, are you certain about the name you just gave me?" Captain Hayes asked. The question caught Daniel off guard. He looked back toward the black sedan. Victoria was still waiting calmly, unaware of how quickly the situation was changing around her. "Yes, Captain," Daniel replied. "That is the name on the documents." Another pause followed. Then Captain Hayes's voice became more serious. Stay where you are. I need more information. Daniel lowered the phone slightly. For the first time since the stop began, he felt something different. Not fear. Not panic. Just uncertainty. The confidence he had carried moments earlier began to disappear because he realized there was something about this situation he did not understand. Back in the vehicle, Victoria watched the scene quietly. She knew the truth would eventually come forward. She knew names, titles, and positions would eventually connect. But she also knew the most important part of this moment was not who she was. It was what happened when someone believed they had power over another person. Because real character was not revealed when people knew your importance. It was revealed when they believed you had none. And as Captain Hayes continued the call, the truth about Victoria Reynolds was finally beginning to move beyond that quiet highway. The silence after Captain Robert Hayes heard Victoria Reynolds's name felt heavier than the words themselves. For a few seconds, Daniel Whitmore stood beside his patrol cruiser, holding the phone against his ear, waiting for the explanation he believed would come next. He expected a simple answer. He expected confirmation that everything was normal. Instead, he heard something in his captain's voice that he had never heard before during a routine call. Caution. Daniel, Captain Hayes said carefully, I need you to listen closely. Do not make any assumptions about this situation. Daniel looked back toward the black sedan. Victoria was still sitting calmly, her hands resting comfortably, her expression unchanged. She did not appear concerned. She did not appear surprised. It was almost as if she already understood that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. Captain, is there something I should know? Daniel asked. Another pause followed. On the other end of the line, Captain Hayes looked at the information in front of him and processed what he had just learned. The name Victoria Reynolds was not just a name. It represented years of dedication, leadership, and service at the highest levels of the United States Air Force. It belonged to someone whose decisions carried responsibility far beyond a local traffic stop. Someone whose career had been built on trust, discipline, and commitment. Captain Hayes lowered his voice. Daniel, the person you stopped is General Victoria Reynolds. The words landed quietly, but their meaning was enormous. Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked back at the sedan, then down at the documents in his hand. Suddenly, every detail of the encounter looked different. The calm answers. The patience. The confidence. The way Victoria had handled every question without trying to prove anything. None of it was accidental. She was not someone trying to avoid responsibility. She was someone who had spent a lifetime understanding it. General Reynolds? Daniel repeated, almost as if saying the name aloud would make the reality clearer. Yes, Captain Hayes replied. That General Reynolds. The highway around Daniel continued moving as normal. Cars passed by. The afternoon wind continued through the trees. But inside his mind, the situation had completely changed. A few minutes earlier, he believed he was the person evaluating someone else. Now he realized he had been given an opportunity to evaluate himself. Victoria watched from the vehicle as Daniel stood quietly. She could not hear the conversation, but she could see the change. The confidence in his posture was different. The urgency was gone. Something had shifted. And for the first time since the stop began, Daniel seemed to understand that the person in front of him was not someone who needed to explain her value. Captain Hayes continued speaking. Daniel, there is something important you need to understand. A person's rank should not determine whether they receive respect. Every person deserves professionalism. Those words stayed with Daniel. Because deep down, he knew the truth behind them. Respect was not supposed to appear only when someone important arrived. Respect was supposed to exist from the beginning. Victoria had not changed because her identity was revealed. She had been the same person from the moment he approached the vehicle. The only thing that changed was his understanding of who she was. And that was the lesson he had not expected to learn. The most important details about a person are often the ones hidden from view. A title, a history, a lifetime of achievements. But even without any of those things, every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Daniel slowly lowered the phone and looked toward Victoria again. For the first time, he was not looking at a driver during a traffic stop. He was looking at a leader. A person who had spent decades serving others and who had remained composed during a moment when many people would have lost patience. Somewhere far away, important conversations were beginning. The situation was no longer limited to a quiet roadside in Virginia. The name Victoria Reynolds had reached people who understood exactly who she was. And Daniel Whitmore was about to discover that when the truth finally comes to light, it does not need to raise its voice. It simply changes everything. Daniel Whitmore remained beside his patrol cruiser, but the confidence he carried at the beginning of the traffic stop was gone. The highway looked exactly the same as it had minutes earlier. The cars continued passing. The afternoon sunlight continued stretching across the pavement. The trees along the road continued moving gently with the wind. Yet for Daniel, everything had changed. He looked back toward the black sedan and saw Victoria Reynolds differently. Not because her rank suddenly made her more deserving of respect, but because he was finally seeing the person he had failed to recognize from the beginning. Victoria had not changed. She had been calm before he knew her name. She had been patient before he understood her position. She had shown professionalism before anyone told him she was a general in the United States Air Force. The only thing that changed was Daniel's perspective. He slowly walked back toward the vehicle. His steps were quieter now. The urgency that had filled the earlier moments had disappeared, replaced by reflection. Victoria lowered the window slightly as he approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence reveals more than words. Daniel had spent the last several minutes asking questions, but now he was beginning to ask himself different ones. Why had he been so certain about someone he did not know? Why had he focused on assumptions instead of understanding? Why had it taken learning someone's title before he recognized the importance of treating them with dignity? General Reynolds, Daniel finally said, his voice carrying a different tone than before. Victoria looked at him calmly. She did not respond with anger. She did not use the moment to embarrass him. Instead, she simply acknowledged him with the same respect she had shown from the beginning. Officer Whitmore. Those two words carried a quiet reminder. Respect did not belong only to people with powerful positions. It belonged to everyone. Daniel looked down briefly. He knew that the situation was not about one conversation on one road. It represented something larger. Every day, people interacted with strangers whose stories they did not know. They saw a few seconds of someone's life and created an entire judgment around it. But a person was always more than what could be seen in a single moment. Victoria understood that better than most. Throughout her career, she had witnessed the consequences of quick assumptions. She had seen how easily people could be overlooked when others refused to look deeper. That was why she had chosen patience. She wanted this moment to become a lesson, not a punishment. Officer Whitmore, Victoria said, what happened here is bigger than me. Daniel listened carefully. There are many people who do not have a position, a title, or someone calling on their behalf. They still deserve to be treated with respect. Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of experience. Daniel understood that she was not trying to protect her own reputation. She was thinking about the people who might face similar situations without anyone knowing their story. That realization stayed with him. The person he had underestimated was the same person showing him the importance of fairness. In that moment, Victoria demonstrated something that true leaders often understand. Power is not proven by how easily someone can make another person feel small. Power is shown by how carefully someone chooses to use influence when they have every reason not to. A short time later, Captain Robert Hayes arrived at the location. His expression was serious, but his approach was professional. He greeted Victoria with the respect expected between leaders and then turned his attention toward Daniel. There was no dramatic confrontation. No need for raised voices. The truth had already spoken for itself. Captain Hayes explained that the department would review the situation and make sure the proper lessons were learned. Daniel stood quietly, knowing this moment would stay with him. Not because of a title, not because of a phone call, but because he had encountered someone who had every reason to be upset and still chose dignity instead. Victoria eventually continued her journey down the highway. She did not leave looking for recognition. She did not need applause. She simply continued forward, carrying the same values that had guided her for decades. And behind her, Daniel Whitmore remained with a lesson that would follow him long after that afternoon ended. A badge can represent authority, but it is character that determines whether that authority deserves respect. The highway slowly returned to normal after Victoria Reynolds continued her journey. The black sedan disappeared into the distance, the sound of the engine fading away until it became just another part of the afternoon traffic. But for Daniel Whitmore, the moment was far from over. Some experiences leave a mark not because they are dramatic, but because they force a person to look honestly at themselves. Standing beside his patrol cruiser, Daniel thought about the first few minutes of the encounter. He remembered the assumptions he had made before hearing a single word from Victoria. He remembered how quickly he had created a story about someone he did not know. And now, after everything that had happened, he understood the most important part of the lesson. The person in front of him had not needed a title to deserve respect. She had deserved it from the beginning. In the days that followed, the traffic stop became a moment of reflection within the department. Captain Robert Hayes reviewed what happened carefully, not with the goal of creating embarrassment, but with the goal of understanding. Leadership was not about pretending mistakes never happened. Leadership was about recognizing moments where people could learn and improve. Daniel participated in those conversations with a different mindset. He was no longer focused on defending his actions. Instead, he listened. He considered the impact of quick judgments and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. He thought about Victoria's words on the roadside. Many people do not have a powerful position. Many people do not have someone who can immediately explain their story. Yet every person deserves to be approached with fairness and professionalism. Those words stayed with him because they applied far beyond one traffic stop. They applied to every interaction between strangers. They applied to every moment when someone had the choice to assume or understand. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds returned to the work and responsibilities that had defined her life. She continued leading, mentoring, and serving with the same quiet dedication she had always shown. To those who knew her, the roadside encounter did not change who she was. She was still the same person who believed leadership was measured by responsibility, not recognition. She was still the same person who believed that respect should never depend on someone's position. The story of that afternoon traveled through conversations not because Victoria wanted attention, but because it carried a message that reached beyond one person. It reminded people that appearances rarely tell the complete story. The person standing quietly beside you may have faced challenges you cannot see. They may carry experiences you cannot imagine. They may have a history that will never appear in a brief interaction. But regardless of who they are, they deserve to be treated with dignity. Months later, Daniel still remembered the moment he learned Victoria's identity. But the name was not what stayed with him the most. What stayed with him was her response. She had every reason to be angry. She had every reason to use the moment to make a statement about her position. Instead, she chose patience. She chose to teach rather than embarrass. She chose to show that true authority does not need to announce itself. Because the strongest leaders are often the ones who do not need to prove they are powerful. They show it through their actions. They show it through their restraint. They show it through the way they treat people who cannot offer them anything in return. The afternoon on that Virginia highway became more than a simple interaction between an officer and a driver. It became a reminder that justice is not only found in rules and procedures. It is found in choices. The choice to listen. The choice to respect. The choice to see a person before seeing an assumption. Daniel once believed authority came from the badge on his uniform. Victoria showed him something deeper. Authority without compassion is only a symbol. But when responsibility and humanity come together, that is when true leadership appears. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson arrives from the person everyone overlooked at first. She did not need to announce who she was. The truth was already there. It had been there from the very beginning.